In this video, we're going to learn an easy two-step progression to learning how to back float. Back floating is one of the harder skills to learn when you're first learning how to swim, but it's also one of the most important skills to learn because learning how to properly back float could save your life. Most students have a much harder time learning how to back float because they feel more defenseless. Imagine if you were a turtle sitting on your back and you're like, ah! That's what it's like to learn how to back float for the first time. Younger students who can't stand up in the shallow end just yet will probably need your help in the very beginning. However, older students or people that can't stand up can easily practice back floats using the stairs and or noodles, and they just may feel more comfortable having someone like you watching while they do this. So let's break down the back float into two parts while using the steps or a noodle as assistance. The most important part of back floating is being comfortable with your ears in the water. Have your students practice floating their head by laying the back of their head on the top step. This will allow for them to submerge most of their head while keeping their face out of the water to breathe. Then for an extra challenge, give your students a noodle to hold on to while they lower their ears in the water and float their head. You can keep their feet underneath them at this point so that way they can stand up when they want. And finally, for a real challenge, have them try to float their head without holding on to anything. Once a student is comfortable floating their head, then they can do the second step by lifting their feet off the ground and floating their legs. Most students will find it easier to use a noodle to help float their legs and get into a back float. Just instruct your students to float their head first, keeping their mouth and their nose in the air, and then pull the noodle down to their waist. That will be bringing them up to a horizontal position. Then, when they are floating, you can ask them to raise one hand or both hands as they get comfortable, which will help them understand that they can float on their back without the help of anything. And finally, you can have your students back float all by themselves by mimicking the same movements they did with the noodle. If they float their head and then pull their hands down past their waist to help float their feet, that will get your student into a back float position. Then, simply to stand up, let your butt drop, let your feet get to the ground, and then raise your head at the very end. Now let's take a look at a few different ways that you may use the noodle to help out with the back float. If a student's hands are too small to hold the noodle, you may want to tuck the noodle underneath their arms. This will help out, but just make sure their ears stay in the water. And you may also ask your students to just lay back on the noodle and practice back floating. This requires a little bit more trust in the noodle, so it might be a little bit more advanced. Plus, getting up is a little bit more awkward. But overall, holding the noodle with your hands gives the student a lot more control with the noodle, and it is my favorite way of using the noodle when back floating. Now let's take a look at a couple common reasons why people have such a hard time back floating, or some mistakes that they will often make. One of the biggest mistakes, and one of the only mistakes that people make when back floating, is by lifting other parts of the body out of the water. So just remind your students, in order to back float, they have to keep their ears wet and their toes wet and their mouth and their nose above the water. Here's one more little thing you need to watch for, especially when teaching adults how to back float. Some adults will often want to try to stand up before getting their hips underneath them. To stand up from a back float, make sure your butt drops first, get your feet underneath you, and then stand up. Remember, the key to learning how to float and being comfortable to floating is to float a lot. So make sure that your students feel comfortable doing this at the steps or with the noodle, and make sure they get a lot of practice and a lot of turns doing this. All right, go get them.